make sure. So we are now recording, and I think we are all ready to go. All right. So this email that you're seeing now on your screen was sent this summer. You can see July 31st. It was sent from the Chief of Staff of a governor's office to an executive director of a state press association. So basically what the email says is that the Chief of Staff from the governor's office is telling that executive director that several agencies have told him, state agencies have told him that members of that particular association haven't been running the notices that were sent to them. They actually formed a committee to deal with the problem. So you've got, so obviously there's obviously a real problem if the governor's office is complaining about public notices that didn't get published. And the problem was isolated to just a few papers, and actually that reminds me, I hang on one second because I forgot to mute everybody, and I apologize. Hang on one second, and there we go. Now you're all muted. All right. So anyway, this is, it was isolated to a few newspapers in the state that weren't running these notices. But the reality is the actions of those papers are imperiling public notice for every newspaper in that state. Most newspapers don't have this problem. Most newspapers run the notices they receive, but even the best papers sometimes take public notice for granted. And that's understandable. They've been running in our papers since the early 1700s, so we tend to forget about them. But when you really think about it, they're kind of amazing. The federal and state governments actually passed laws requiring themselves to disclose information about their activities. So they represent the best of self-government. Along with open meeting and FOIA laws, they're an important part of what we call the three-legged stool of government transparency. Unfortunately, we're in danger of losing them. And we're only going to prevent that if we stop taking them for granted. So that's what this webinar is about. It's about how each of us in the newspaper business can take a fresh look at public notice so we can maintain our historical franchise as their publishers. Now, I'm going to start today by briefly telling you about the Public Notice Resource Center, the organization I represent. And then we'll discuss the general state of public notice around the country. And I'll conclude with best practices. I'll talk about what all of us can do to help maintain the legal structure that mandates that public notices continue to be published in newspapers. All right, so the PNRC, the Public Notice Resource Center, it's a 501c3 charitable organization. It was founded in 2003 by the American Court and Commercial Newspapers, or ACCN. ACCN is a trade association that represents legal newspapers like the St. Paul Legal Ledger and the Finance and Commerce in Minneapolis is a couple of examples of ACCN members. We're also supported by state press associations around the country. Minnesota Newspaper Association is one of them, so we thank you for that. And we're kind of like a think tank for public notice. So we're the only national group that provides research and education and advice in support of newspaper notice. When PNRC was founded, the first thing that we did was conduct research about why the public notice laws were originally created. And here's what we discovered. They were built on four key elements. First is accessibility. Public notices must be accessible to everybody in the jurisdiction that's affected by the notice, which doesn't mean that everyone has to read it. It just means that everyone has to have an opportunity to read it. Second, they need to be published by an organization independent of the government agency or the corporation or the individual whose activities are the purpose of the notice. So in other words, we can't have foxes guarding hen houses. Here's a real important one. There's got to be a way to verify that the notice was actually published in accordance with the law. And archiving is another essential element. That is, all notices should be archived for the use of the judicial system, for researchers and historians and so forth. So each of these elements are critical aspects of the checks and balances that public notice was designed to foster. And we'll touch on each of them throughout our talk today. So as an industry, we're on the defensive. That laws that would move all or most public notice from newspapers to government websites are introduced every year. This year was the worst we've seen. 22 different states introduced some form of law that would either eliminate entirely public notice from newspapers or substantially reduce the number of notices that are published in newspapers. And one of those bills, by the way, was in Minnesota, but fortunately it didn't get anywhere. It never got a hearing, never got out of committee. In fact, you guys had an excellent year public notice wise. We tracked 7 different bills that relate to public notice in Minnesota, 7 that we were aware of. 5 of those 7 would have added new newspaper notice requirements in certain circumstances, and one of them even passed before it was vetoed by the governor. I'm trying to remember, it was something about real estate, municipal real estate, whatever. My sense is that the reason the governor vetoed that bill had nothing to do with the notice issue. So you had a great year in Minnesota. Lisa and her team at MNA should take a bow for that, along with all of you members. Nevertheless, your day will come eventually. So we have work to do. We have work to do at that macro level where the laws are passed, but also at the micro level where every newspaper operates. So every newspaper that runs public notices needs to share in the newspaper industry's collective responsibility. And we're going to focus primarily on that micro level today. So here are some of the arguments that our opponents use when they're focused on the public policy aspects of public notice. The internet is faster than print. It's more efficient. When you post things on the web, they last. They don't get tossed out with a newspaper the next day. They last for the duration of the notice period, whether it's a week or 2 weeks or however long it is. Unlimited internet has unlimited storage. At this point, cheap unlimited storage. So complete documents can be posted on the web. And it offers broad availability. These days most people are online or have some way to get online. The other one we hear a lot is it's free to put public notices on government websites. And I put free in quotes because it's not really free. Or I guess the way I would put it is, when someone tells me that it's free to put public notices on government websites, it just tells me they're not planning to spend any money on design, on presentation, on marketing or technology like a newspaper does, and that they don't really care whether anyone actually reads their notices. Nevertheless, superficially at least, these are all good arguments. But the key point is that most politicians who fight to take public notice out of newspapers, they're not thinking about public policy. They've got another motive. They're seeking revenge for tough reporting, or what we're seeing more of these days is they're stoking anti-media resentment for political gain. Here's a couple of recent examples. New Jersey Governor Christie was our first example. Last December, so it's been almost 12 months now, the governor waged an all-out war on the newspapers in his state, and he used the state's public notice laws as a weapon. He basically threw his weight behind the bill that would have moved all notice in New Jersey to government websites, to over 2,000 different government websites. So during that battle, he issued a news release entitled "Media Billionaires Continue to Demand New Jersey Taxpayer Subsidy." And in that release, he said, he called New Jersey's public notice laws corporate welfare, and he said they were a shameful, antiquated, self-serving, money-making statutory scheme. This is just one of the things. He said this battle took place over a period of a couple months, and Christie had a lot of not nice things to say about public notice in newspapers. Here's another guy, Maine Governor Paul LePage. He doesn't like newspaper notice any better than Christie does. He turned to the state's public notice laws, just like Christie, to exercise his wrath. And in June, he backed a bill that was very similar to the one in New Jersey. And here's what Paul LePage had to say about public notice during his battle. Requiring legal notices to be printed in newspapers at a fee does nothing but prop up a dying, antiquated industry. The requirement is a taxpayer subsidy of the worst sort. All right, so I've got a good news and a bad news here. Good news, both of these bad public notice bills were defeated in both New Jersey and Maine. Now the bad news. We're in an era now where governors wage high-profile battles against newspapers, and they weaponize the public notice laws. That is something that we haven't seen before. So we've never seen these battles taking place at the level of the governor. It's actually not a great trend, unfortunately. So here is an anti-newspaper politician who is actually more effective than Governor Christie and Governor LePage. Her name is Trudy Wade. She's a state senator from North Carolina who represents Guilford County, where Greensboro is. Greensboro is the county seat, in fact. Senator Wade really, really dislikes the News and Record, which is the county's largest newspaper. So what did she do? In 2013, actually the 2013 legislative session, they have 2-year legislative sessions, she introduced a bill to move all public notices to government websites. It didn't pass. The next legislative session rolled around, 2015. She introduced a bill that was very similar, again, would remove public notice to government websites. It didn't pass. So this year, this new session, 2017, she introduced a new improved version of the bill. And by improved, I mean it actually grappled with the public policy issues surrounding public notice, like some of the things we've already discussed, verifiability, archiving, cost, all these issues that are real issues about public notice. It was the thing that I found weird. It was almost like she was reading the materials on the PNRC website and constructing her bill around some of the issues that we raised. She also added a political sweetener. The money that was raised by charging private parties for foreclosure and other judicial notices would be used in her bill to fund an increase in teachers' pay. So she was able to make the argument that if you pass this bill eliminating newspaper notice, we're going to be able to help teachers by increasing their pay. Another thing she did that was different than Christie and LePage, she was a lot more coy about her true motives. So she claimed the bill was designed to save money and help teachers and so forth. And but you know, as the regular session, well, anyway, so let me leave it at that. So she was reticent about attacking newspapers. Basically, for her, it was about the issues. But as the regular session, you know, came to a close in June, she still couldn't get the bill through the North Carolina House. So what she did is she amended it. She amended part of it to apply only to Guilford County and called it a test. And then in the final hour of the regular session, and I really mean the final hour, there's about 45 minutes left before they were going to adjourn, she put a hold on another bill in the Senate, so she needed to get it passed in the House. There's another bill in the Senate that had bipartisan support. She put a hold on it to force a vote in the House, and ultimately a bill that she couldn't get passed through the regular means, she got passed. But the governor vetoed it, and there weren't enough votes to override the veto. So at that point I thought, okay, so we're safe for the year in North Carolina. But Senator Wade was highly motivated, and I underestimated her persistence. And I didn't realize that in North Carolina, state legislators can write local bills, quote unquote local, that the governor can't veto. So I remember I said before, the bill she had introduced that passed and the governor vetoed was the government notice part was focused on Guilford County, but other parts of that bill were statewide, so it wasn't completely local. So she made this bill, what she came back is wrote another bill that was just focused on Guilford County, and it passed 3 weeks ago. So the citizens of Guilford County will no longer have newspaper notice as of December 1st. A couple of small newspapers in the county have said that they're going to need to close as a result of the new law. So Senator Wade did a number of things that were different than we normally see in these battles. And these are the factors that when we see these are the things that should be raising our antenna. It's easy to beat, not easy, but you can defeat the ham-handed efforts of people like Christie and LePage, and they're not serious about what they're trying to do. So here are some of the factors that are different in the case of Senator Wade. First of all, she learned the issues, and she drafted a bill that grappled with the real public policy dilemmas that are raised by government website notice. We're starting to see more of that, unfortunately, and it's worrisome. There's a bill introduced in Pennsylvania this summer. Fortunately, I don't think it's going anywhere, but it was another one. When I read it, it was serious. It dealt with public policy issues in ways that we don't normally see from these anti-newspaper notice bills. Second thing, and I mentioned before, she was mild, reasonable. Her rhetoric wasn't overheated. It was clear to anyone who scratched the surface, if you knew what was going on, she was seeking revenge against the newspaper for its coverage, but she kept that hidden in the public. She was highly motivated and persistent and smart. And last, she was politically savvy, and she had some experience and some juice in the legislature. She could get things done. So these are all factors that will make our jobs more difficult moving forward. Just a side note here, last week, the commissioners in Rockingham County, North Carolina, so it's, I think, a little bit more rural county in North Carolina, passed a resolution. So the county commissioners passed a resolution asking the North Carolina General Assembly to pass a law allowing them to opt out of newspaper notice, just like they did for Guilford. So it's not a good sign in North Carolina, and hopefully we're not starting to see dominoes fall there. So this quote that you see on your screen is from an editorial in New Jersey's second largest newspaper. This was during the battle over the Christie bill that we talked about. This is from the record that used to be called the Bergen Record. Christie's bill would result in the closure of some small weeklies, hurt the bottom line of all newspapers, and ultimately cost 200 to 300 people their jobs. So I'm here to tell you that this is not an argument that we should be making, ever. I remember a common theme that was echoed by both Governors Christie and LePage was that our current public notice laws are nothing but a taxpayer subsidy designed to prop up newspapers. It's an argument we hear a lot from politicians when they're opposed to newspaper notice. But by focusing on the financial impact on newspapers, if public notice advertising disappears, isn't this statement in this slide just the corporate welfare argument in reverse? This wasn't the only newspaper, by the way, in New Jersey that made this point. It was really a central element of the argument that newspapers in the state were making during their battle over public notice. And now I won't go into the details, but there were reasons that were unique to that particular situation that convinced papers in New Jersey that that's an argument that they should make. And I followed it closely. I think they made the right decision. Normally, I don't want to rely on this argument, but in this case it worked, so we're going to need to cut them some slack. Nevertheless, I think we can all agree that we're on firmer rhetorical ground when we can make the argument that public notice belongs in newspapers because it works. Because it's still the most effective way to notify citizens about city council meetings and agency hearings and tax proposals, foreclosures, all the other government and private activities that require official notice. And that argument starts with readership. Circulation is down, but there's still plenty of people who pick up your paper and read it, or you wouldn't be in business. If people weren't reading, politicians like Christie, Paul LePage, and this guy wouldn't be complaining so much about our coverage. Here's a great example of the continuing effectiveness of newspaper notice. Like many other states in North Carolina, counties are required to run a notice in a local newspaper before they exercise liens on property for overdue taxes. So back in March of this year, Moore County, North Carolina, ran a 12-page notice that cost $8,000. So in return for that $8,000 investment they made to run that public notice in the pilot, the county ended up collecting 60% of its outstanding property taxes. So they were owed $1.37 million. And then, actually, it was a little less than a month, they had collected about, I think it was about $820,000. So by the time this article was published on April 10th. So obviously, the pilot wrote a story about the impact after the notice ran, and here's what the Moore County's tax administrator told the pilot. This is the guy who was responsible for actually placing this 12-page notice. He said the newspaper still turns out to be an effective mechanism. People look for other people's names in the paper. It's just one part of the process for collecting property taxes. Now, let me go back a slide and show you this. As you can see, I used the pilot's website to illustrate this particular slide, but that's only because I didn't have access to the newspaper. And I point that out because I want to be clear here. It was mostly the newspaper, not the website, that produced this result in Moore County. I also want to mention one other thing, which is if when this happens with you, you have a particular notice and that you know that it had a real impact, that it had an effect, you should consider running a story about it the same way that the pilot did, for a couple reasons. Number one, it focuses attention on the power of newspaper notice, but it's also the kind of story, in this case, about how the county collects overdue property taxes. It's the kind of story that helps readers understand a government process that most citizens are only vaguely aware of. But for the time being, let's forget about your print readership for a moment, okay? Just for a second. Just for the sake of argument, let's focus on digital alone. Again, most bills seeking that try to remove newspaper notice look to government websites as the alternative. But newspaper websites almost always generate considerably more traffic than government websites. And let's take a look of a few examples. So the last couple of days I've been looking at websites, your websites, and some of the county and city websites in Minnesota. And what I did is I used it's a traffic comparison site called similarweb.com. It's not as accurate as your internal web traffic measurement tool, but it's good enough for our purposes here. So you can see here the Star Tribune this is about 22 times as much traffic as the Hennepin County's official website. And on this slide shows you the rank. This is the Star Tribune has the 1,277 most trafficked website in the U.S. And you can see the comparison there. How about the Bemidji Pioneer? And I'm sorry I'm not getting that name right. I should have gotten it right because I first learned about Bemidji in the TV show Fargo, I think it was the second season, it makes a big appearance there. So however you pronounce it, the Pioneer, the paper in Bemidji, gets about 60% more traffic than the Beltrami County website. The Post-Bulletin, it gets almost 3 times as much traffic as the city of Rochester, which had more traffic, by the way, than the Olmsted County website. So I used it here to be fair for comparison. Same thing with Beltrami County, the city of Bemidji website it had so little traffic that SimilarWeb didn't even measure it. And Hennepin County has more traffic than the city of Minneapolis website. In any case, this is a powerful argument in favor of not moving public notices to websites. Keep them in newspapers, and for no additional cost, you get both the print version of the newspaper and the website, which has a much larger readership than the government's website. But we can only use that argument if you consistently post the notices on your website. And let me add a clarification here, because I've confused a couple people on this point in the past. I'm not arguing here that public notice should be moved to newspaper websites. The print newspaper is still the best way to get notice out. We're simply arguing that government transparency would be substantially decreased by moving notices from newspapers and their websites to government websites alone. We're all for governments providing notice via their websites, but it's as a supplement and not an alternative to newspaper notice. Here, real quickly, here's another factor that makes government websites a bad place as an exclusive source of public notice. They're used primarily for transactions. So this was a study that was done by Pew Research back in 2014, a couple of years ago. And what it shows is, again, mostly transactions. People renew their driver's license, they apply for government benefits, they go to the website to pay a fine. Nobody goes to government websites to read public notices, even when they're published there. And there's plenty of evidence to support that. So I'm going to give you a couple of recent examples here to illustrate that point. And let me just mention up front that both of these examples are from state environmental protection agencies. So unfortunately, what's happening is the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and its state affiliates have been killing newspaper notice for the last 20 years, and it's blown up in their face on at least a couple of occasions that we're aware of. There may be more, but these are two that I've learned about. Number one. So what you're looking at on your screen now is an EPA terminology. This is called a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a CAFO. It's on the banks of the Buffalo National River in Arkansas. So back in December of 2012, people in Newton County, Arkansas, which is where the Buffalo River is located, they were stunned when they learned that the state's Department of Environmental Quality approved a permit to operate this hog farm near their homes. The only way they could have learned about the permit application would have been to visit the agency's website, where notice about it had been published for 30 days. The hog farm got built despite several lawsuits, and 4.5 years later, this is still a huge controversy in Arkansas. If you Google Buffalo River hog farm, you'll see that they're still writing articles about it, not necessarily about the notice issue, but just about the farm itself. Here's when the controversy about the lack of notice first blew up. Here's what the head of the agency said about the notice that they posted on their website. So this is the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality director. She said, "I understand the way people feel. They feel like this happened and nobody knew anything about it." So on 30 days on their website and nobody knew anything about it. Here's another more recent example. This is from Michigan. So folks in Michigan were surprised to learn last November that the state's Environmental Protection Agency issued a draft approval. They didn't approve it. It was a draft approval of a proposal to allow Nestle to pump more groundwater for its Ice Mountain bottling plant in Stanwood, Michigan. Now, notice that this particular proposal had been on the agency's website for 42 days, but nobody knew about it. So guess how people in Michigan eventually learned about this proposal? From a news story in the Grand Rapids Press, and that's how I found out about it. A reporter at the Press heard about it and wrote a story that was published in the press, in the newspaper, and on its mlive.com website. It was a huge story in Michigan that generated several follow-up stories and thousands of comments opposing the proposal from citizens throughout the state. This, the thing that's key here, it was really interesting, is they, again, 42 days on the government website, they didn't receive a single comment published. The article was published in the newspaper. Again, thousands of comments flooded in. They had to extend the notice period, and I believe the notice period just ended. They extended it a couple times. So after this whole thing erupted, the director of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality admitted, like the director in Arkansas, she admitted that the notice on the agency's website just wasn't enough. 42 days wasn't enough. Was this advertised and noticed in the way it should have been, she asked? Probably not, it appears to me. 42 days on a government website, and it still wasn't enough. So both of these examples illustrate an important issue about an intrinsic difference between the print and online experiences. The print version of a newspaper happens to be a communication medium that's particularly well suited to be a source of public notice. So unlike the internet, the print newspaper is a perfect vehicle for public notice. And why is that? That's the result of serendipity. When we read a newspaper, the size of the page and the tactile experience, the fact that we can touch it and feel it and move our eyes around the page, lead us to find things that we didn't expect to see. So that guarantees that public notices in local newspapers are going to be seen by many people in the community who didn't pick up the paper intending to read the notices. Not many people pick up newspapers to read the public notices, but many people see them anyway. We behave differently on websites. When we're on the web, we're goal-oriented. We go to a website looking for particular information, and so we're unlikely to find information that we're not specifically looking for. Public notices on a website get lost and are easily hidden. Now, it's not impossible to build some level of serendipity into a website. That's what we pay web designers to do, but it's far more difficult than it is to do with a newspaper. So there's plenty of other reasons why newspapers are still the best delivery system for public notice. Newspapers don't go down like websites. They can't get hacked. Newspaper readers are more civically engaged than people, on average, than people who don't read newspapers. That's many studies have shown that. The digital divide isn't closed yet. This is an especially acute issue in rural areas, as I think a lot, in Minnesota, your rural areas, a lot of you who publish there know that lots of people still don't have high-speed internet access. People are abandoning PCs for mobile, which simply means that it's going to be even harder to get people's attention with notice. It's hard, who's going to read notices on a smartphone? How do you get people to read them as opposed to even a computer? You can't hide it in the paper. This goes back to the independence issue. You need to have an organization that's independent of the government publishing these things, or if they give them the chance and they're going to do their best to hide information that they don't want anybody to see. And last but not least, print is self-authenticating, which simply means that in most states you can use a copy of a newspaper or an affidavit to prove in a court of law that a public notice actually ran. So by contrast, if it was, for a website notice, you need someone to actually come into court to testify. So we still have lots of arguments in our favor, but we have lots of work to do. There's no doubt about that. Collectively, newspapers, we have to get much better at public notices if we're going to maintain the franchise. And I think generally speaking, what this is about, again, we talked about it earlier, it's, we tend to take public notices for granted, treat them like an entitlement. We're not treating the government agencies that place these things like customers. And, that's a huge deal. When you hear complaints from the government officials, not politicians, but the government officials who don't want to run newspaper notice, it has nothing to do with transparency, and sometimes it's not even about cost. It's a hassle for them, right? If it's whatever the agency is or whatever the government office is, they've got lots of things to do, and it would be much easier for them if they didn't have to go through the whole process of putting an ad in a newspaper as opposed to just posting it on their website. So our job is to make that as easy as possible for them, in the same way that I hope we do with customers who are buying the other kinds of advertisements that run in our newspapers. So here's some of the things. Let's talk about the best practices now. Here's some of the things that everybody can do at their own paper to make public notice, to get more impact on public notice, which is what we need to do. First, too many notices in newspapers are too small, or they're too hard to find. If you make them too small, or if they're indistinguishable from the text that surrounds them, you're just telegraphing the fact that you're taking them for granted and don't care whether people actually read them. And let me show you a very recent example. This is from a newspaper. This is actually just a few weeks ago from a newspaper in Wyoming. It's, I'll admit, it's a inherently difficult notice to make easy to read. It's I think these are it's about oil and gas rights or something. And by the way, this is taken from a PDF, so you're seeing exactly what it looked like in the newspaper. See, it's almost unreadable, right? If you put this in the newspaper, and people immediately will move away from it. Your eyes glaze over when you look at this thing, and there's, again, like I said, this is an inherently difficult notice to make easier to read, but there's a number of things that could have been done, bullet points maybe. Somehow you've got to work at it to make sure that people see the notices that are published in your paper. Now, I picked out this particular ad. It could have been worse. They could have published it without any paragraph breaks, where everything, this is, you have paragraph breaks here, so where everything would have run together. And I've seen a few of those. I've seen public notice sections where the newspapers take several different notices and run them all together without any paragraph break. Newspapers that do that, they're making it unreadable, or you're just announcing to the world that they view public notice as just a way to get paid. We can't hide the notices, so sticking them in the back of the paper and forgetting about them will kill public notice. Now, having said that, it's not just about placement. The back of the paper is fine if we find ways to be more creative in how we present them, and that's mostly about design. So here's some design ideas. I should have mentioned earlier, you don't need to copy anything on these slides. We'll make sure you have a copy. I'm going to make both a copy of the recording of this webinar and a PDF of this slide deck. So you'll get this. But in any case, these are some ideas that the design consultant Ed Henninger shared at a best practices conference that we held last year in conjunction with the National Newspaper Association. So some of these may work for you, others may not. What's important is to start thinking about how to use design elements to draw attention to the notices in your paper. It's the same way you think about drawing attention to the stories and the advertisements that you publish. Here's an example of a paper in Kentucky that redesigned its public notice page. So the owner of this paper is a former reporter who used public notices in his reporting, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, not about his particular case, but just in general, using reporting on public notice. Anyway, he did it. He understood that public notice has news value, so he decided to make his public notice page look more like his news. Now, Kentucky law requires 7-point type. He used 10-point type to match his news page, and you can see he used 30 and 35-point headlines, and there's plenty of white space. So people are going to see these notices in his paper. And when I talked to him, and he told me that local government officials were appreciative, but the biggest reaction he got was from his readers. He says he hears every week from readers who thank him for doing this. Now, whenever I make this presentation at a newspaper conference, in other words, when I'm standing in front of a live audience and I can, unlike today, I can actually see your faces as I make this presentation. What I've noticed when I'm doing that is that some of the publishers in the audience roll their eyes at this particular slide. It's inevitable. I see it. I get it. You have more things to worry about than public notice. You've got other pressing challenges. You've got challenges coming at you from every angle. So maybe it doesn't make sense for your company or for your market to do something quite like the Georgetown news graphic did. But the larger point remains. Circulation is down, so we need to do something to find a way to drive more eyeballs to the notice. So we talked about this one earlier. For the newspaper industry to maintain public notice, it's crucial for all of us to run the notices on our websites. It's so important that press associations in 12 states help to get laws passed requiring newspaper notices to be published on the websites of the newspapers that run them. Now, you probably know that Minnesota is one of those 12 states. So in Minnesota, you're required by law to publish the notices on your website. I saw at least one newspaper website that didn't do that in Minnesota. I think I may have missed them, but I saw, I think, one paper that posted them not on their site, but on the MNA statewide website, which is a great website. And I thought the presentation was really good and how this particular paper does it. But I still think a best practice is to publish this on your own site and the Minnesota site. There's no public notice police with their handcuffs that are going to come around arresting newspaper publishers in Minnesota who don't do that. But it's the thing that we should be doing if we're going to be making the argument. And actually, I think it's less about the argument. What it's really about is just showing legislators that we're serious about drawing more attention to the notices, and that people can actually, we're using our websites to drive more eyeballs to the notices. Having said that, we can't do this. This is a big no-no. We can't put them behind a paywall. Making readers pay to read public notices on your site is a sure way to make enemies in the legislature. So again, this is an issue with, when you think about it, you're charging people to subscribe to your paper. If or most of you are, if people pick up your paper at a newsstand, they have to pay for it. And so, logically we can think, well, why can't we do the same thing on websites? And unfortunately, logic doesn't hold here. It's just the way things are now. And we've been paid to run them. When you put them on your websites, don't put them behind a paywall, because people do not find that acceptable. And when I say people, most importantly, legislatures who are in control of your fate on this issue. So now that you've published them on your website, you need to make sure that people can actually find them, right? So what I did, again, like I said, I visited a bunch of different websites and newspaper websites in Minnesota. And let me give you a couple of examples of newspapers that are doing it right. This is the Montgomery Messenger, and you can see that they've got the navigation bar here, and right there in the middle, public notices. Here's another one, the Pope County Tribune. And here's their navigation bar, again, right in the middle on the top. Maybe it's not maybe it would have been better on this. This navigation bar, which is easier to see. And actually, I'm only kidding. Sometimes I'm a little bit demanding. But the main thing is make sure that there's some link on your home page so people can actually get to the notices on your website. Let me show you one other thing that I found just to illustrate a couple of points. So this what you're looking at here is a note. This is a public notice page from the Star Tribune. And here's one thing I really liked a lot. See what they have here? So what it looks like is they put the notices into a database, and they created links to separate categories of notices. And as a user, I would find that extremely helpful. It already tells me before I even look at the notices what it's in general, what it's about. Star Tribune's a big paper. They got lots of resources, but I haven't seen, even from other big papers, I haven't seen anything quite like this. So kudos to the Star Tribune. So let me mention a couple other things about this particular page. A couple things that maybe not about the page, but things that could have been done differently on the Star Tribune website. So the only way that I could get to this page was by clicking on the classifieds link on the Star Tribune homepage. But here's the deal. I knew to click on the classifieds link because I'm in the newspaper business, and I've seen many, many other newspaper websites do the same things. Maybe the majority of newspaper websites put their notices in the classified section. I think the reality is the great majority of your readers don't know that public notices belong behind the classifieds link. So I think it's important for public notices to have their own standalone link on the home page. Second, and this is another thing that most newspapers do, or many newspapers do. You see what they're calling them here? They're calling them legal notices. And, I think the law sometimes calls them legal notices, but we prefer, instead of legal notices or legal ads or just legals, for marketing purposes, we encourage you to call them public notices instead of legals or legal ads. The public notices sound like a civic good. The words have a positive connotation. Legal ads or legal notices sound scary. It's like somebody did something wrong and they need to be told about it. And I'm just going to real quickly, this is not a huge point, but it's something I'm working on to try to drive through the newspaper industry to see if we can get this done. Here's a quick example that I hope makes this particular point. All right, you see two ads here, right? These are not public notices, despite this, what it says on the top of the page. These are used car ads, but the words public notice are so powerful that these used car dealers decided to use those words to get people to pay attention to their used car ads. It's impossible to imagine them doing the same thing with the words, they wouldn't put legal notice, just wouldn't do it. So the words public notice are a gift, so let's use them exactly that way. So I told you before, we're going to talk a little bit about reporting on notices. And so PNRC gives out an annual journalism award for stories that were originally based on a public notice. And the stories on this list all won awards in our contest. And these are all, as you can tell, embezzlement, closing of a nursing home, and so forth. These are all important stories that landed with a big impact in their communities. But there's no reason that you can't report on some of the less scintillating notices that run in your paper. It's an easy way to add value for both your readers and your public notice advertisers. And people will read those just run-of-the-mill public notice stories. And here's a recent example. About 6 weeks ago, Scranton, Pennsylvania Times-Tribune, which really does public notice well, that particular newspaper. They published a story about a county tax sale. So this is the same kind of sale that we saw earlier that took place in Moore County, North Carolina. In this particular case, the story was published concurrently with the notice. So the same day that the notice was published, they published a story about it. So it was less, this one wasn't about the impact of the notice, and it was more about the process the county goes through leading up to the publication of the notice and the property sale. And look what happened. It was the most read story on the Times-Tribune website that day. So people will read stories about even the run-of-the-mill notices in your paper. So we encourage you to report on the notices that you can in your paper. But here's a key point. Before you can report on them, you need to read them. If you're not reading them, make sure that someone on your staff is responsible for doing that and for reporting up the chain. Tell you a quick story here to illustrate this point. There was a publisher in California last year who lost the public notice contract in his county because he didn't know it was put up for bid. So guess where the notification about the bid process was published? If you guessed that it was a notice that was published in his own paper, you win, right? What happened is his much smaller competitor read the notice and he didn't. So his smaller competitor read the public notice page on a particular day in his paper. He didn't, and he lost the contract. And I learned about this from a column that the publisher wrote. I set Google alerts to this kind of stuff, and I saw a link, and I read this column, and he basically was accepting responsibility for what happened. He promised to run the notices in his paper for free until he got the contract back. Now, I'm not sure how smart that was strategically, but it sent a message about how seriously he takes his responsibility to be the provider of official notice for his community. Public notice laws are really specific, right? They tell you when the notices must run. They tell you what must be in the notices, what the words are that must be published in the notice. So when your employees aren't trained to know that, it can cause major problems. So it's an especially big problem when the government personnel who are placing notices are also poorly trained. So you don't want that, the blind leading the blind. And the key point here is you can't count on the government to get it right. In fact, you should make this part of your value proposition to the local government agencies and your other public notice customers. Put yourself in the position to be able to tell them, we won't just publish anything you hand us. If you get something wrong, we'll let you know about it, and we'll make sure your notices comply with the law. It's embarrassing and bad for all of us when a city council or a county commission has to reschedule a meeting or resubmit a bids due to improper notice. So let's make sure that our employees know what they're supposed to be doing so we don't make those kinds of mistakes. So remember back at the beginning, I talked about some of the essential elements of public notice from the very beginning of when the concept of public notice was first developed. The ability to archive has been one of those essential elements. It's an advantage that print will always have over digital. Unfortunately, newspaper archives are disappearing in the digital age. Fewer publishers are doing what this woman is doing. I guess they let in this particular case, they let their bound volumes get to the point where they needed to resuscitate them. But the reality is that lots of newspapers aren't even doing bound volumes anymore. And so what's happening is we're relying on digital storage and programming language, and platforms change, and the archives become unreadable. Floppy disks, CD-ROMs, remember those? How many public notices have been lost to history because that's where they were stored? Now, maintaining bound volumes is still the best option, but we realize the horse has left the barn on that one. So the second best option is a strong agreement with a third party, like a library or a local historical commission, to maintain your paper's print archive. We did a survey last year and learned that there's lots of publishers that are now doing that. They rely on third parties to maintain their archives. But a large percentage don't have an agreement, or if they do have an agreement, they don't really understand what's in it. So if you have an agreement, well, let me back up. If you're doing this, you got it with a library, historical commission, someplace else, are handling your newspapers, you should make sure you have an agreement. Make sure it's in writing, and that it guarantees that organization won't just dump your papers out back if storing them becomes inconvenient someday, or if someone new takes over the library, or for whatever reason. We need to make sure that they're maintained. We touched on this authentication a little bit earlier. Public notices often need to be authenticated for use as evidence, and an emailed PDF won't work in a court of law. So you'll need an affidavit with a notarized signature. The best practice is to provide affidavits as a matter of course, and some states actually require that by law. But even in states where it isn't required, an affidavit really represents added value to the public notice advertiser. And on this point, here's something I found just last week. So I did the same thing for the folks in South Carolina last week, and I was looking around on their this is actually from the South Carolina official legislative website, so scstatehouse.gov. And I don't know if you can read this here, but what this basically says is don't trust this website for legal purposes. For the official version of the South Carolina Legal Code, use the print version. So this is about as clear a demonstration as you could find of the problems that websites have with the verification and archiving issues. So in some states and counties, public notice prices are set by law, but when they aren't, sometimes we get hurt by papers that charge excessively high prices. And I think it's really an issue in areas where either because of the law, there's no competition between papers, or maybe there simply isn't another paper in a particular area for people to be able to place their notices, and the paper is charging excessive rates. And so what happens is we hear about it from the legislators. Now, Minnesota does have a rate law, so I presume this isn't an issue in Minnesota. It basically says, the law says public notice ads shall not exceed the lowest classified rate paid by commercial users for comparable space. So presumably overcharging isn't an issue in your state, but I wanted to mention it anyway. Now, I want to end these best practices with a crucial best practice that really has nothing to do with your paper's operations, but has a big impact on whether we're going to be able to retain public notice. Build a relationship with your legislative representative. The key is to begin building a relationship before you need anything from them. So before the bad piece of legislation has been introduced, build that relationship. All of us prefer to do things for people we know, and politicians are no different. So if you haven't already done so, now is a good time to start building that relationship with your state legislative reps and their staffs. I know that many of you already do this, and I apologize for preaching to the converted, but this is an important thing. So we're fighting an important battle here. It's not just for our newspapers, but for the communities that expect us to serve as their eyes and ears. If we don't do the job that we need to do to protect our franchise and the responsibility for providing public notices left to the government, everybody loses. So thank you for listening. I also wanted to thank everyone who signed up for the monthly newsletter. We issue the newsletter the first Tuesday of every month, so you'll be receiving your first issue in a couple of weeks. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, PNRC accepts charitable contributions. So you can contribute by making a tax-deductible donation at our website, pnrc.net, and we've made it pretty easy for you to do that on our site. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the chat thing here. and I hope, this is, unfortunately, I've added a few slides and it's taken longer than it used to, and I apologize for that. And now I'm going to unmute everybody. That's not, oh, there we go. I think everybody's unmuted now. Now, before everybody starts talking at once, I see there's already one question from Sue. You mentioned accessible should be published in the jurisdiction of everyone affected by the notice. Curious of your input on those that choose to pick the lesser cost, even though it's not reaching those that are affected. Good question, Sue. This is an issue that it's tough to address because different, some states, pick an official newspaper, and in these, I don't, it's not an issue. In some states, it is an issue, and I don't know, what else to say. I think, competition is generally a good thing. I think it's going to be difficult to get legislators to think otherwise. And it's a good question. I don't have a good answer for it. I apologize. So from Jordan, what happens when your city council or staff does not want to publish their council meetings? We checked legal guidelines, which are a little muddy, but concluded they are not required to publish the meeting minutes. Well, that's, I think here's the reality is I don't know why in that particular county or in Minnesota are meeting minutes not required to be published. The reality is there's certain holes in public notice laws throughout the country. I'll give an example. Texas, they don't have foreclosure notices published in newspapers. And there's certain categories. I think meeting minutes generally are, in most states, published in newspapers, are required to be published. If they're not, I think let me put it this way, and if it's not required by law, the best thing you can do is appeal to their better angels, right? In other words, if they want people to actually read the minutes, publishing them in your newspaper and putting them on your website, and maybe you can even tell them how you would do it so people would pay attention to it. Maybe that's a way to convince them. Again, this is another one I don't have an answer for. I'm assuming that you're right about the law and that they're not required to publish the meeting minutes. I apologize again, not having a great answer on that one. Other than, like I said, if they're not required, see if you can convince them some other way. I realize that's a tough row to hoe. Any other questions? Anyone? I think you're, I see some of you are unmuted. So is anyone out there? So Jordan, thanks. We might try that. Good luck, Jordan. Let me know, by the way, if it does work. I'd love to hear about that. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you again, everybody, for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to focus on public notice for an hour, and I apologize also I apologize for going over a little bit. It's the last couple of weeks I've been doing that. I think we added a couple slides, and so Marie-Louise, anything else on your end?
I'm just going to say thanks to everybody for taking part in the webinar, and remember that you'll be able to access the slide deck that Richard's going to be sending through. And thanks very much and have a great day. Thanks for taking the time.
Bye-bye.